So as you were probably just seeing from our conversation, Miriam and I actually don't know each other in person. We actually, our connection is through science Twitter. So this is the idea that social media does work and can help create new connections. So Dr. Goldstein is the Director of Ocean Policy at American Progress. She got her PhD from Scripps, where she did work primarily in plastic pollution. She has been, from there, she went into policy, where she became a leader of the legislative team for Congressman Jackie Speer. And she was also a legislative fellow for Senator Edward Markey. And so she's been working at the Center of American Progress for how long, Dr. Goldstein?
About a little over 2 years.
All right, so over 2 years now. And so she's going to be talking about the sea change, the role of federal policy on a warming world.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you also so much for having me here today. This is, I think, my first time giving a virtual seminar looking only at my own video. So I really don't know how it's going to go. I do strongly encourage you to ask questions all throughout the presentation. I have the Q&A box up on a little screen, so I should see them. And I'm going to try to talk for 40 minutes. And then I would love to have lots of time for Q&A. One thing that I have learned in policy is I get very tired of hearing myself talk. So please ask questions. So today, let me see if I can move this little box. Sorry. So I can see my own screen. Okay. Well, that's good enough. All right. So today it's sort of a combo how I ended up in my career and then some aspects of what I actually do for a living talk. So hopefully it'll be enlightening. And I did want to say that while I am at the Center for American Progress, where I'm the Director of Ocean Policy and the Managing Director for Energy and Environment, I am just representing myself today, not the Center for American Progress. And that means I can just say whatever I want, which is really how I like to live life. So the structure of my talk today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my career path. I'm going to talk about a little bit of what the Center for American Progress is and what specifically our ocean policy program does. I'm going to give you two examples of our big ideas, not just ours, but like two big ideas that we're working on for in this year, 2020. And sort of it'll hopefully help you see how these science concepts and data and research that you're learning about now go into making policy. And then leaving, as I said, lots of time for questions and discussion at the end. So, Dr. Hill talked about this a little bit in my intro, but here's how I sort of ended up where I am. I did my PhD in oceanography. There I am in my fabulous hat with my extremely high-tech plankton sampling device, which is definitely in no way not a turkey baster that I am holding. It's totally a turkey baster. Turkey basters are actually really good for manipulating zooplankton. And so that's me in grad school in the middle of the Pacific somewhere on a tall ship sampling zooplankton and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I did that and then worked in Congress as a staffer for a number of years and then now at the Center for American Progress. I will not say it was an entirely smooth transition. There was a slightly mediocre picture of me in my when I worked for Senator Markey on the way to work, wearing suit jacket on the top and my deck boots, complete with like my name in Sharpie on the bottom because it was a rainy day and it made sense to me. So I was definitely the only person in the Senate wearing like rubber boots with my name written on them in Sharpie. So here's in a summary of my career path, and I will say, ask me what my plan, they still ask me what my plan is, or they ask me if I had a plan. I had no plan. I still have no plan. It is okay to not have a plan. What I have is essentially principles, is what I've discovered is what I like is working with smart people who are also nice and not terrible on issues that I care about, and on issues that I care about and that are important. So that's been sort of my guiding principle. So I did marine ecology as an undergrad. And I took a bunch of time off before I went to grad school. I worked in environmental consulting. I worked in outdoor education. That's a little picture of the Lakes of the Clouds hut in New Hampshire on Mount Washington, where I worked as a naturalist. I worked in construction in the circa like 2005, 2006. I then went and did my PhD in biological oceanography on plastic debris in the North Pacific. After that, I was a fellow and a staffer in Congress, and now I am at the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank. So it's been a twisty path, and I don't know what's next. I still have no plan, but I think that the principles will remain the same. And for now, I'm very much enjoying my think tank life. So what I did in grad school is I studied the ecological effects of plastic in the North Pacific subtropical gyre. You all have probably heard about the Great Pacific. Here's a picture that I took when we were in it. As you may or may not know, a lot of people think it's like an actual big island of trash that you can go to and walk on. It's not. It's a high concentration of mostly tiny pieces of trash with occasional big things like this ghost net that you can see in this picture mixed in. So we went out and we got the money for this in 2008, and this expedition that I led was 2009. So there was a lot less that was known about it then, and we were really interested in essentially applying the tools of oceanography to see what was all this plastic doing. Because the North Pacific subtropical gyre is not like a really productive area that's producing a ton of fish that people eat. It's like there's not a lot of life there compared to other parts of the ocean, and it was far from clear what was going on. So we quantified how much microplastic there. That's a sampling of what most of the plastic out there looks like. You sort of run a zooplankton net with very fine mesh through the water, and you get these tiny little pieces. So we did that. And I also looked at effects on zooplankton and on the fouling community. The fouling community being the animals that grew directly on the trash, like the barnacles you see in that picture. In the top picture, that's a copepod that we had studied that I had done some incubations with. So I deliberately introduced fluorescent plastic particles to see whether the copepods would eat them, and they did. There's been a lot of work since I did this showing that many ocean animals, including plankton, do ingest microplastic, and it does have an effect on their bodies. So in Congress, my job was very different. As a fellow, I was a Knaus Sea Grant Fellow, which is a program that allows people who have just finished grad school to go work either in the executive branch, so usually in NOAA or another agency, or in Congress, the legislative branch, for a year. I was a legislative fellow, so I worked in Congress for a year for Congressman Markey, who that same year was elected to the Senate. So I actually got to do both chambers. And so in there, as a staffer, your job is to support the member and to provide you provide ideas, you try to implement their policy proposals, you work with other members to further their goals. So as a fellow, I was on the House Natural Resources Committee with the Democrats. The committees all have staff. And then later on, after my fellowship was over, I went to go work with Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who's in the right-hand picture, and worked for her for about 4.5 years. During energy, environment, transportation, agriculture, science, technology. That's a pretty normal portfolio for House staff to cover because there's maybe 4 staff who cover all the issues. Happy to talk about what staffing is like more if any of you have questions. In the picture, it's one of my favorite pictures because she's holding up this really horrendously photoshopped thing that I made, but she got on the front page of the New York Times with that because there was a effort to mess with the Endangered Species Act that protects endangered species through a defense bill, and we made this like joke that this lesser prairie chicken must be a national security threat, and we photoshopped horribly a grenade launcher on it, and I wrote a really funny speech for her, and it was a whole thing. Happy to talk about that more because a lot of the policy is also in getting attention, which is something that has been brought to a different place in the last couple of years. I thought I'd talk specifically about some of the work that I'm most proud, and you'll note that it doesn't have anything to do with the ocean. I'm sorry, the work that I'm most proud that I did when I was a staffer in Congress, because it doesn't have anything to do with the ocean, because I made the choice to work again with my principals, with smart people who are also nice, working on issues that I care about that are important. So Congresswoman Spear is one of those people. And so I worked on what she was interested in. And she is a big proponent of women's issues. She's really interested in preventing sexual harassment and assault. So one of the things that she led that I worked on was a bill to change the way sexual harassment and assault allegations were processed for members of Congress, because before we changed it, there was very little accountability, and members could essentially they could conduct themselves in the workplace without very many limits at all. So we changed that. I wrote the initial version of the legislation that changed that. That's now law. Oh, it became the Congressional Accountability Act Reform Act, which is not the most catchy title, but the original bill was called the Me Too Congress Act. Congresswoman Spear also introduced legislation to stop sexual harassment in federally funded science. So this was happening around 2016 or so. This is sort of when Me Too started kicking off. And at that time, there was no mechanism for any of the major federal funding agencies that fund science, like NSF or NIH, to revoke funding from scientists who conducted themselves poorly. So, for example, scientists who had actually sexually assaulted their own grad students were still able and did receive federal funding from these agencies and indirectly from taxpayers. So Congresswoman Spear and I wrote a bill to make it so that if it was proven that a scientist or a principal investigator had engaged in sexual harassment or assault, their federal funding could be revoked. Now, this bill didn't go anywhere, but after a lot of work from Congresswoman Spear, from many other members, from the national academies, from many scientists and survivors who spoke up, no bill was ever passed, but this policy is now the policy of the National Science Foundation and of National Institutes of Health, one of the two biggest science funders. So we managed to contribute to changing that, and I think that hopefully we are on a better track. Another way you can change policy through Congress without passing any legislation is through public shaming. So this was, you might remember, and this is quite some time ago now, it's more like 2015, there was an issue with small children eating these Tide Pods. This was before it was like a Tide Pod challenge and teenagers were doing it, which that came after. But because they are so colorful, there was some really tragic cases of small children popping them in their mouths, biting down, and then the detergent, which was very toxic, would just like squirt down their throat and burn them. And there was even one little boy who actually had been in a homeless shelter with his mother who died because of this. So we proposed this came about because I saw a peer-reviewed study in a medical journal on how damaging these Tide Pods were for small children, toddlers. And so I said, well, I took it to Congresswoman Spear. She said, we should definitely do something about that. I wrote a bill. She introduced it along with some senators who also had companion legislation. And it was so embarrassing for the detergent pod companies that they made most of the changes and safety improvements that we wanted to anyway, without us passing the bill at all. So that is another thing. And that is why today these Tide Pods are in more childproof containers. And also they have a different composition on like the little on the outer wrapper that you don't take off that used to taste sweet and now it tastes bad. So this is the part about the ocean policy, politics, and science that I will now talk about my current job. Before I go on, does anyone want to have any questions? It is extremely weird to talk to my own face without seeing anyone else's face. And I feel like I'm babbling on and on like a crazy person. You can just type it into the Q&A.
I know it's weird. I think you're doing a great job. And I was going to type in that I think it is very refreshing that people do have an impact and can change things. So thank you. And I would ask towards the end if you could give some more insight on how people like us can help people like you do that sort of thing more. So that was going to be my question, but you can get to it later.
Well, yeah, let's do that at the end. Thank you for talking to me. It's like so weird. I love giving talks, but like it's just so weird to not see anybody. So thanks
I
for
know.
doing I mean, now I have to laugh at my own jokes. It's very sad. All right, so moving on. So, and again, you guys might already know this, but the United States is an ocean nation. So we're going right back into the ocean part of the talk, and the rest of the talk will be sort of climate-y and ocean-y. The U.S. controls areas that are actually larger than its land area, and that is because of the exclusive economic zone, which goes the United States controls most of the things in the ocean out to 200 miles. The first 3 to 9 miles, depending on what state you're in, are controlled by the states or territories, and then the rest are controlled by the federal government. Now, it's not just the areas off of what we think of as off the 50 states, because we also have these territories, not just Puerto Rico, but these Western Pacific territories, Guam, the Northern Marianas Islands, American Samoa, and these other uninhabited islands, like, for example, Johnson Atoll. So that's a lot of ocean. This is a function of sort of a World War II territory expansion, but to this day, those are controlled by the United States. And the federal government has a major, major role to play in what happens in those vast areas of oceans. This is a handy chart, which is not actually that handy, showing what the federal government does in the ocean, which is scattered across agencies, like so many agencies and departments, and none of whom talk to each other all that effectively. And I don't expect you to read this or parse it. I just wanted to show how very scattered governance of the ocean is across the federal government. There are also many laws that govern the use of the ocean. This is just, I sort of picked some of the most pertinent topics that people are interested in and picked out some of the laws that you might have heard of. And you're dealing in ocean policy, you're dealing with all of these concepts, all of these laws, and how they interact. So one of the ones, for example, is the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, lovingly known as Magnuson-Stevens, which is the law that governs how fisheries in federal waters are managed and prevents overfishing. Also sets up the Fisheries Management Councils, if any of you are familiar with that process. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, very pertinent to Louisiana, governs how energy leases and extraction occurs in federal waters. Antiquities Act is often used to protect special areas. So that's just a few of them. Oh, another highly relevant Louisiana one, the National Flood Insurance Act and Flood Disaster Protection Act sets up the federal flood insurance program and how flood areas are managed and mapped, also highly pertinent to the ocean. So just a little sampling there. On top of these federal laws, of course, depending on where you're at and what you're trying to do, there are state laws and tribal laws. I tend to deal a lot less with those simply because I've worked in Congress, which is obviously federal, and because CAP is a federal-facing organization, but those are extremely relevant depending on what you are trying to accomplish. So what do we do at CAP? CAP is an independent, nonpartisan think tank. We develop our progressive-leaning organization. We have opinions. We do not pretend to not have opinions, which is the fun part about being at a think tank. So we have a point of view, but our point of view is supported by data and logic and thought. That's what we strive for. So we develop new progressive ideas. We work to shape the national debate. We try to advance good policy where we can, and we try to prevent what we think is bad policy where we can. So that picture is of an event we had in 2019. The folks going from left to right are Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is a former head of NOAA and a marine ecologist at Oregon State University, Vicki Spruill, who is the head of New England Aquarium, John Podesta, who was a senior advisor to President Barack Obama on climate change. She's also the founder of CAP and the chief of staff for President Clinton. And Kalani Kiocho on the right, who is a Native Hawaiian advocate for the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Sanctuary. So I'll give you some examples of what we do just so you can get the scope, and then I'll talk about two things specifically. So in the way of developing new progressive ideas, we literally come up with new ideas, we write white papers about them, we publish them on our website, and we tell people about them, do social media, talk to Congress. In other times, administration is not super interested in hearing what we have to say, but in other times we would have talked to the administration about them. So here are some examples of new ideas. For example, ocean-based climate solutions is an area that we're working really heavily on. What does it mean to have the ocean engaged in the fight against climate change? I can talk about more about that if anyone's interested. How do we prepare fisheries for changing climate? I'm less familiar with the Gulf of Mexico, but along the eastern coast, along the East Coast, fish are moving already hundreds of miles north. Where I grew up in New England, when I was growing up, there was a healthy lobster fishery in Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts that is now completely wiped out because all the lobster are in Maine, and those lobster are going to Canada. Meanwhile, the iconic blue crab that used to be in the Chesapeake mostly has actually already rounded the Cape and is overwintering in New England. And those level of changes are frankly inconceivable. If I could invest in something, I would invest in like the future blue crab fishery of New England, but it's very depressing to, when the place that you grew up is really no longer there anymore in that way, and that's what's happening. Also, I mean, on the more policy front, fishermen don't have the permitting that they need to fish the fish that are already there. They have the permits to fish the fish that used to be there, and this is a huge problem. We also work to shape the national debate and advance good policy. So this is more about doing interpretation of things that are already happening to help policymakers and decision makers understand that and to help them push good policy. So, for example, we've done a lot of work on aquaculture because we do think that aquaculture is an important part of a sustainable future ocean, but we don't think that we can just do it willy-nilly and with any species and with not looking at feed and escapees. So in that paper, American Aquaculture, we outline think aquaculture should be done and the policies and laws that would get it there. And frankly, we contrast it with some proposals now, one of which is an executive order from this administration that we don't think they're doing it the right way. We also have many proposals on habitat protection. This is because fisheries right now are managed in like a little bit of an antiquated way. You look at the fish stocks themselves, but you don't look at the habitats that support those fish stocks. And so we work a lot on trying to help protect the habitat that are the engines of these sustainable fisheries. So we have both proposals for marine protected areas, which I will talk more about, and how to strengthen fishery habitat protection through the fisheries management process itself. This is all really arcane to talk about in abstract. I realize it's like very complex. I'm happy to talk more about it to anyone who is interested. And finally, we do a lot of defense these days of arguing against policies that we think are bad. We do not think this current administration has been good for the ocean or the environment, and we say so. We also think that we also sometimes work on the state level. So for example, a couple years ago, there were really bad toxic algal blooms in Florida where this like poisonous algae killed everything, including this whale shark that you see there on the beach. And this was a unfortunately predictable result of a combination of bad land use policy, bad sewage policy, and climate change. So we spend a lot of time outlining what we think is bad and what should be done differently. We hope to spend less time doing that someday. So I will sort of end, or well, not end. This is sort of like this is probably I'm like maybe 2/3 of the way through. Halfway through, I guess, and it'll spend a bunch of time on these two big ideas that CAP has been like thinking about and developing in 2020. And I think hopefully this will give you a sense of sort of how science fits into policy and what policy looks like as you develop it. These two ideas are 100% clean future, and I will explain both of these, and protecting 30% of America's lands and water by 2030. So 100% clean future first. What this means is net zero emissions by 2050. This is not something that we came up with. This is something that you might remember in 2018, the IPCC, the International Climate Body, set out this report that said we had, at that time, 12 years to stop climate change, to hold warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so they are the ones who set this goal to say, in order to make this goal, in order to hold climate change to 1.5 degrees, this is what we need to do. And so they worked backwards from that, and they said we need to achieve this net. The world needs to stop emitting net by 2050, and in the interim, reduce like 43% of emissions. So that's what we took as our baseline. And this was, of course, the IPCC process is developed by an international body of like prestigious scientists, like on a huge body of peer-reviewed research. So that started with science. In response, there has been some action on the state levels across the country along DC and Puerto Rico enacted policies within their states or districts, or territories, to do this on their own. This policy also started to pop up in other fora, like presidential candidates put it in their platform. This was also part of the Green New Deal and a Blue-Green Alliance plan, that's a labor alliance. So this structure started to pop up everywhere in policy, driven by the IPCC report. But what did it actually mean? Like, what is it? Like, how do you actually do this? How do I switch my slide? There we go. So at CAP, we said, okay, what can we learn from the states? What are the elements of actually moving towards this goal of 100%, about 100% clean economy? And it came up with these 3 pillars. You have to have that target of a clean economy by 2050. Like, that's the goal. Adopt that goal. It has to be a worker-focused approach. It cannot just be like this sort of coming from on high and just let people like fall where they may. It really has to deal with this concept of a just transition, good paying, high quality jobs, because a lot of these fossil fuel jobs are really good jobs. And it's really important to recognize that and to really focus on how to have equal or better quality jobs that are in a clean economy. So that's incredibly important to this working and being successful. And finally, there needs to be a commitment to environmental justice. There are low-income communities and communities of color have historically suffered very disproportionately high levels of toxic pollution. I am sure I do not need to tell you guys about this, given the infrastructure in Louisiana, but there are it's not where a lot of these, for example, refineries are built near historically Black communities and communities that didn't have the political power to stop these very polluting facilities from coming in, nor the power to stop them from polluting in both legal and illegal ways once they are there. So to get to this goal, we have to address the justice components and to help these communities no longer suffer under this disproportionate burden of pollution. So here's where the science and the graphs and the math come in, and I must say that I enjoy a good graph, so I hope you do too. So I'm going to give you this overview of how you actually do this from a federal level in each sector. So here's the baseline. We see historical emissions in the solid line, and the baseline is the dotted line. Emissions were dropping from 2005 to 2017, but like we're track anymore, partially due to the demise of a clean power plan, and partially due to a bunch of rollbacks this administration has done on meeting clean energy goals. So this does not, by the way, take into account the pandemic. This is data that ends at last year, so do keep that in mind. So, okay, the orange line is where we need to go. The mid-range is the IPCC says we've got to get 40 to 60% below how much pollution we're emitting in 2010. And we've got to do that by 2030. That's the midpoint that we need to get to. For the US, that means 43% reduction by 2030. That is a lot of pollution to get rid of, but we can do it. So Well, here's if we do a lot of investment in clean energy, solar, wind, existing nuclear, you can reduce it by this much, this blue wedge. Sorry about that embargoed. It is definitely not embargoed until October 10th. That was October 10th of last year. So by incentivizing electric vehicles and smart growth, you can reduce it by this other wedge. Electric appliances and buildings for codes for making them more efficient. You can reduce it by a little bit more. Agriculture and waste, another wedge. And so I actually forgot, I'm going to go back a little bit. I forgot that I said exactly what each of these are on the left. So you can see on the text block on the left there, it says specifically what the policies are that make that wedge. So for clean electricity, it's a clean electricity standards, price on carbon, emission controls for power plants, etc. For electric vehicles, there need to be all of these incentives. Our electric appliances, it's basically a lot of incentives for efficiency. Efficiency is a super easy way, not super easy, but like we know how to do it. Like you just have to, it's efficiency is a way that we know how to do to get a lot of emissions reduction. Agriculture, it is investing in these particularly ways of dealing with agricultural waste that prevent methane emissions. Clean manufacturing. Manufacturing is a huge source of carbon emissions. Obviously, factories need like a lot of energy to run, and they mostly get that from dirty sources. So, for example, to reduce emissions through clean manufacturing, there need to be federal incentives for buying clean things for federal purchasing to have a buy clean standard. So the federal government would itself only buy things that are manufactured in a clean way, and things like retrofitting factories. Lands and I don't know what nets is. What did I mean by nets? I don't know. I'm just going to keep on talking. This is the natural solutions part. So to get this other wedge, we need to protect existing nature and then sequester more carbon through, for example, reforestation and restoring coastal wetlands. And even with all of those things, which are highly ambitious, there's further improvements that need to be made to get there that we frankly don't quite know how to do yet. But what we need to do is invest in science and research to know what we need to do, because technology is constantly improving. So if that sounds ambitious, it really is. But there is so much more you can read about it in the full report, which is on CAP's website if you want to read it. But I think what I want to leave you with here is that, first of all, like this is incredibly ambitious. This is a whole rejiggering of the US economy, essentially driven by federal investment. But what's neat about this is that this concept was completely driven by science. It started from the IPCC report and then goes methodically through sector for saying you do this, then you get this much reduction. And this is a very science-based approach to a massive change, but a massive change that we need to make, or the future will be very hot, wet, flooded, and unpleasant. What's been exciting over the past few years is this approach to reaching 100% clean future has been reflected in policy. So it started with the scientists and has sort of filtered out through CAP, taking the science and sort of translating it into the policy that I've gone over. And now it is reflected in plans like the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis report. The Senate Democrats also did a report on outlining their plan to fight climate change, and many political candidates have set this net zero by 2050. That's considered to be like the minimum, and for folks who are taking climate change seriously. And that's really exciting because even the minimum is very ambitious and would get us to a really good place. So I'm going to go totally. So, I should say, so that's it for 100% Clean Future. If you're interested, you should definitely look at the report, and there's like lots of one-pagers. It's really written to be accessible. I'm going to move on now to protecting 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. And this started with, again, a very science-driven goal. Scientists everywhere have said that we are undergoing an extinction crisis. There are a million species at threat of extinction. There's a big, similar to the IPCC, it's the, I never remember the abbreviation, it's the IPEBS, I believe, something on biodiversity, International Panel on Biodiversity and something. I can send it to you or put it in the chat if you want. But there's a big international, again, illustrious science-driven report that found that we are in the middle of an extinction and biodiversity crisis right now. And the solution to this is, again, it's both extremely hard and not that hard, is that we need to protect more nature. And the minimum that we need to protect to, again, driven by science, is about thought to be 30%. That is the minimum that we need to do to stop the extinction crisis and to protect our critical ecosystem services, like, say, drinkable water, breathable air, delightful things like that that we enjoy. So CAP has taken on trying to see what would it look like to do this in the US? What would a US goal of protecting 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030 look like? I should say this graph shows natural area loss by region. So you can see, for example, that it's highest in the Midwest because the Midwest is so much agriculture and very little left that's not that, but is least high in the West, which has been, for historical reasons that I'm sure you're aware of, least developed. The South is very interesting because the South is a biodiversity hotspot, but also has among the least protections. So that's perhaps a discussion for later. Anyway, where we're at now is 12% of US land and 26%, well, really 23%, we can get into that, as US ocean is protected. And what's really interesting about this is support for this is really high and very bipartisan. And, people in the US really love our natural areas. So when you look at, when we did a poll last year and we polled this, 54% of all voters strongly support this goal and 32% somewhat support it. So overall, that's 86% of people think this is a pretty decent idea. And this report was very bipartisan. There was some differences, as you can see on the bottom, among parties, but at minimum, 76% of people, again, thought this was a great idea. So Americans we want to save our nature, and that's great. So to move on to the ocean side, which is what I'm working on, we do have 23 to 26%, depending on how you count it, of our ocean protected. 26% overall, 23%, which is called strongly protected, which is to say commercial activity is not allowed. But the thing is, most of this is in the Western Pacific. So if you remember that map I showed you of the territories, there's just these really big marine protected areas out there in the West Pacific and the Central Pacific where very few people live. And that's great. We should protect those areas. Like Papahanaumokuakea is really special. The Pacific Remote Islands are really special, but that is not indicative of the whole breadth of marine ecosystems in the US. So it is very skewed to those areas. And when you look at how we did that, under what law we did that, about more than 96 to 99% of it is done by monuments. That means under the Antiquities Act, which means the president did it. President George W. Bush protected a huge amount of ocean in the Pacific, and then that work was followed up by President Obama, who protected more. The other tools are less used as a percentage of area. So what's next? On 30 by 30. So we have to figure out how to make it more representative of US oceans. That's what we're working on now. How do we also incorporate tribal management? How do we incorporate the uses that are already happening? And how do we protect places that may or may not have compatible uses with each other? An example right now is offshore wind development, particularly on the East Coast, and commercial fishing. Those are not necessarily compatible uses depending on how you do it, and both affect habitat. So trying to balance those uses is the current challenge of the moment as we try to protect more and more of America's oceans. Lands people have like a whole different set of things that they're working on, but frankly, beyond the scope of this talk. However, if you're interested, I'm happy to send you some of their writing. All right, so what's next? Right now, here's where we're going. Because of the moment that we find ourselves in with climate on the precipice, nature on the precipice, these are really the same things. Ocean conservation is climate action. The ocean is 71% of the world and absorbs over 90% of the excess heat that we are emitting. So in order to protect the climate, we have to protect the ocean. And so what does that actually mean? It means reducing emissions. The most important thing we have to do is reduce emissions. Without reducing emissions, the rest of this is not going to be as successful. Emissions are what drive, of course, warming, but also ocean acidification, which is the actual acidifying of ocean water such that animals that form shells. We need to protect blue carbon ecosystems. Those are the ocean and coastal ecosystems that actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and square it safely away for geologically relevant timescales. In the US, those main ones are mangroves and salt marshes, seagrass beds to a lesser extent. And so we need to protect those. And there is no reason to not do this. There's only advantages to protecting those coastal ecosystems because along with storing carbon, they protect coastal communities and they protect facilitate fisheries and biodiversity. They're great. We should do a lot more coastal restoration. Also, doing coastal restoration creates jobs. It's all kinds. It's all to the good. We should do a lot more of it. And then also we're working on framing conservation actions in terms of the climate. So what does this mean? Like increasing ocean resiliency. That means we have to manage our fisheries sustainably. Fish stocks that are overfished are not going to be stable to climate change, and then that's going to be it for them. And we have a big cautionary tale in the form of New England cod, which were seriously overfished for decades, and now they will not come back because of climate. The climate has changed, and baby cod can no longer grow up successfully. And if they had not been overfished, maybe that would not have been as dire, but they were, and here we are. So we don't want that to happen to other fish stocks. Increasing ocean resiliency by protecting these habitats that are the ones that actually create these fish and also provide the biodiversity and all of the benefits of stability, medical cures, all good stuff that the biodiversity provides. And we need to stop the pollution that is sickening and killing sea life directly. That is, of course, oil pollution, plastic pollution, and nutrient pollution. And all of these things really weaken the coastal ecosystems in particular that provide most of the ocean's productivity and fish stocks and recreation, all kinds of good stuff that we want to. So that is the end of my talk. And I will just leave you with, I think, this really great quote from Molly Beatty, who's a former director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And she says, what a country chooses to save is what a country chooses to say about itself. And I think based on the polling, based on all of the things that people say, like we, the American people, we want to move in the direction of protecting our climate, protecting nature. We just have to figure out the steps to get us there. And that is one of the things that I am very proud and honored to be working on at CAP and hopefully in other parts of my career, whatever might happen next. So I will leave you, these pictures are all ones that I myself have taken at various points in my time, and including my very favorite amphipods in the upper, really pretty. So when I try to remember, why it is I do what I do, I look at mostly the amphipods, not the dolphins, but you do you, and try to keep on going, taking one step at a time. So with that, I will end and, I'm going the wrong way on my slide, and take any questions. I saw there was one, but I will also take a pause.
There are a few in there. I can read them too,
yay.
or you can read them. Which do you prefer?
Oh, I can just read them unless you have a preference. I'll just go in order because
Go for it. I don't think everybody else can see them, so you're going to have to.
Okay, I'll just read them out loud.
Yes.
Yeah. And Jamie, what are we, just so I know, what is our time looking like?
Technically, we still have 30 minutes, so I think we're
okay.
Perfect.
Cool. Plenty of time.
Yeah.
Plenty of time. Okay, great. All right. So question, you mentioned how the blue crabs of the Chesapeake Bay have moved further north. Climate shifts are obviously responsible for this, but what sort of changes are causing this and why exactly? That is a great question. I am not a blue crab expert specifically, but I will do my best. And then if you hear contradictory information, I was wrong and they're right. But here's my understanding. This is pretty much a climate-driven strictly climate-driven phenomenon. And this is because the Gulf Stream goes up the East Coast, and there was always crab larvae riding up the Gulf Stream. So, for example, always, even before climate change really warmed things up, you could see tropical fish in Rhode Island in like August and September because the larvae would come up from the Carolinas, Bahamas, but the thing is they would never survive to grow up. So there was always that supply going all the way up to New England. But what changed was as the water has gotten warmer and the Gulf of Maine, which is the area from Cape Ann in Massachusetts all the way up through Maine, is warming faster than 99% of the rest of the ocean as a function of the way the currents go there. And so because of that warming, animals like the blue crab they were always there in the summer, but they could never overwinter. Now they can overwinter. They're still not, I think they're in huge quantities, but considering the trajectory, it's frankly inevitable. Like I have a friend who's a salt marsh scientist in Massachusetts and originally from Baltimore, so he knows a blue crab when he sees one, and he's started to find them pretty frequently in the salt marshes in Massachusetts, and ones that are old enough to clearly have overwintered. So that is essentially just a function of temperature, a function of warmer winters, a function of warmer waters. So I hope that answers that question. Fortunately, blue crabs are delicious. Unfortunately, they are voracious predators. There is no swimming crab that is anything like it in the Gulf of Maine now. So when they are there in significant quantities, they will cause massive changes to the ecosystem. So we will see what happens. It will not be boring.
I think that's actually what Dr. Hill, some of what she works on, but she had to jump off for a meeting. So we'll have to pick her brain on that one later because she does work with blue crabs.
Oh yeah, so she'll know a lot more about essentially their ecology and like what they're likely to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm just going to go in chronological order. Are the 9 states across the country that are moving towards 100% clean energy coastal and therefore care the most? If so, how can other coastal states that are not doing this be made to care more, as well as inland states without coasts? I do not have the list in front of me, but I am pretty sure they are not all coastal. They are, let's see. What can, let me, I can't find the list. I'm sharing my screen. It's too much. It'll just go horribly wrong. But I am like 90% sure that, like, for example, Colorado is one of them. And what is the most recent one? There's just one that got a new one. Anyway, I can find that link and send it around with a list of all of them. But I don't think this is necessarily a coastal thing in that, like, states without coasts have also seen really severe climate change just in different ways. Of course, Colorado is seeing really severe wildfires. It's seeing these mountain ecosystems that are almost like islands disappear because as the mountains warm, these plants and animals that were only found on the top have no place to go. They're seeing changes in water. So I don't think that like the coast is the driver there. I think it's the whole climate emergency that we find ourselves in that's starting to affect aspects of many people's everyday lives. And so, for example, looking to California as one of these for something where people's everyday lives have been catastrophic by these unprecedented wildfires. And so once people see this in their day-to-day life, I think adopting this 100% clean energy standard becomes a lot more intuitive. But I will say other states, I mean, I think the sort of formula that I laid out there has found to be the success, which is that you really have to have those 3 pillars. You have to set standards. You don't necessarily have to say how to get to those standards. Like that's how you work from the standards backwards. That's been the innovation. So you need to set the standards. And then you need to bring on these other key groups, which is labor and environmental justice communities. And those 3 pillars make for a pretty strong climate policy. And that's a big change. And I am, by the way, not a climate expert. I just like fake one by hanging out a lot with my climate colleagues at CAP. But my understanding is like this is a big change from past proposals, which, for example, were more focused along cap and trade. They're almost a technocratic solution, and those did not succeed. So this 3-pillar approach seems to be a more successful one, at least on the state level right now. So I hope that answers that question. As a European, I can relate to the fact that a country controls a mass of water larger than the dry land itself. Can you find a way to use the ocean resources to improve the US economy while lowering emissions? That is a great question. And I think the answer is absolutely. I mean, the big thing that is happening now is offshore wind. We need to find out a way to do it right. It needs to be put in the right places, and it needs to try to minimize the impacts on fisheries and protected species. Like right whales are just very endangered, very dumb, will not stop running into things. So they're a major concern. But I think that the offshore wind on the East Coast especially, but also increasingly as technology evolves potentially on the West Coast, is just an enormous opportunity for abundant clean energy. So that is the easiest answer. The other ways for the US economy I think that we can just get these it wouldn't lower emissions, but it would sequester carbon. By doing coastal restoration, we've seen huge economic benefits. For example, the stimulus that Obama did in the 2008 recession, for every $1 million that was invested in coastal restoration, 15 jobs were created. And these are like good paying jobs, like engineering, construction jobs. And that was a very high return for federal investment. So we can, by restoring our coast, we can really invest both in our economy and in our environment, and we can sequester carbon. So it's a really winning proposition. So these are just two off the top of my head. I see later on they suggested hydropower, wave power. Yeah, and those are active areas of research. My understanding is that the technology for those is not as developed as it is for offshore wind turbines. So I don't think I'm not sure if there are working facilities. I am, again, not super knowledgeable about them. But those should all be part of a future sort of ocean climate solution. All right, I'm going to check to see whether anyone had questions about my answers at the end. Nope, not yet. Okay, I'll continue. How would I go about working as a congressional executive staff, especially living in a state that historically relies on oil and gas? Louisiana does not have many congressional members that vote for clean energy or even believe in climate change. Yeah, it's a challenge. That is super real. Well, let's do congressional first. Yeah, congressional staff is tough. I mean, I don't think you can go into working for a member of Congress thinking like you're going to really change things like on Louisiana's entire economy. You can sort of work around the edges, but like as a junior staff member, they're not going to be like, oh, no one's ever made that argument to you before. Wow, so glad you're here. So I would say, but different people make different choices about members of Congress they'd like to work for. Some people want to work for members with whom they agree on policy. Some people really want to serve their district or their state. And both of these are totally legitimate and fair ways to go. It's just that you're going to end up working on different issues depending on where you're from. Like you'd have a really easy time if you were from California finding a member to work for on clean energy, but it's tougher being from Louisiana. There's like no magic solution there, unfortunately, if you want to work on energy issues. If you want to serve the state of Louisiana, it's a little easier, but then you have to sort of do what that member wants to do. In the executive branch, it's a lot easier because those are not tied to elected. Those are, things like the Department of Energy, Department of Interior, NOAA. So you can find a lot of ways to work in energy, clean energy through working in the executive branch, because they're not like, they're not directly working for an elected official, so you work on those issues. I mean, but of course, working in this administration has made its energy priorities very clear. So you'd be working on their energy priorities. A different administration that they would set their own priorities. So that's, I mean, I wish I had a better answer, but now exactly how to do it here. There are two general paths. One is to work your way up from being an intern. Now, the good news is, and this is excellent, that more and more of the internships are paid, because a major source of inequity in the past has been, especially congressional internships are unpaid. Therefore, only people whose families can afford to just like send them to DC and support them could be congressional interns, and that is clearly ridiculous. Like I could not have afforded that at that time in my life, and nor my family would have also thought it was ridiculous. Like, why don't you get a job? Like, this is like the silliest thing you ever heard. So I did not do that. However, more and more of these positions are paid and are paid at like a quasi living wage, and it is very common for interns to have other jobs. So that's one path. I don't know the entry level and the executive branch, just like never having been in that position. Sorry. So you work super hard as an intern, you try to get hired onto an office, you impress them all, and you work your way up from these sort of entry level positions, which are staff assistant, which is an administrative position, and legislative correspondent, when you answer all the letters right to the members of Congress. Like you just draft letters all day. They are not glamorous, but that is how you, like, by doing well at those, then you work your way up. The other way is to go in at a later career stage, which is what I did, by doing a PhD and then becoming a fellow. So in Congress and the executive branch, these are these fellowship programs. However, you might notice that I spent 6.5 years of my life doing a PhD, making a very, very small amount of money. I was lucky to make any money. You get paid to do a science PhD, but like less than an intern would make, let's just say. So like that opportunity cost is not something you should do on purpose. Like I didn't know that I wanted to do this. So if you know you want to work in policy, you should absolutely not do a PhD. Like that's not the right path. You should do the first path. But if you do a PhD and then you decide you want to work in policy or a master's, then you can do this fellowship path. And so I came in as a legislative assistant, which is sort of the next level up. So those are the ways that I know about. And and then there's a third way, which is to work for trade or advocacy groups and learn about policy and then try to move into an office from there. So there's a lot of movement between folks who work for these different groups. I'm from working in Congress to working at CAP. There's like lots of folks, like there's someone I work with all the time who went from working at Oceana, which is another ocean nonprofit, to go working in Congress. Like all of these things move around. And that would also be the case for Louisiana. So if there's like a Louisiana group whose mission you believe in and you go work for them, that would also potentially be an entry path. So I hope that answers your question. I know you mostly focus on the ocean, but do you believe that reducing carbon emissions and following these proposed solutions could stop or slow down the sixth extinction we are experiencing as a whole? Well, stop, no. Slow down, yes. Like, so these are solutions to keep the climate change to 1.5 degrees, which is the scientific consensus, is that like that's what we have to do to stop the worst effects of climate change. The problem is that's not no effects. Like right now we're at about 1 degree of warming and we're seeing horrible effects. And that's horrible, but the solution is not to like not do anything. So we have to try to do what we can. And it's not an all or nothing game. So 1.5 degrees is very ambitious and will be very difficult with things are the way they are. 2 degrees is probably more realistic. There's a lot more absolutely horrible effects, like 99% of coral reefs disappearing under a 2-degree scenario. It's only like 93% under a 1.5 degree scenario. It's horrible. It's like really depressing and awful. The thing is, this just gets worse and worse and worse the more you go. So we have to try to, we try to be as ambitious as we can while also like being, I guess, I don't want to say being realistic, but just because you can't have everything is not a reason to have nothing. So pushing for as ambitious a goal as we can and like fighting for every victory that we can. So, but yeah, no, it's a really horrible scenario and some things are definitely going to go extinct. And I don't think this will stop the 6th grade extinction, but it will hopefully keep it from getting worse. Like we're going for maybe like one of the lesser extinctions and maybe not like the Permian extinction with like everything going extinct. I mean, sometimes I cheer myself up by thinking in geological time. Okay, that was a really depressing answer, sorry. But there really is a big difference between 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and like the really, really horrible scenarios above 2 degrees. Also from the people point of view, like Bangladesh being not a country, but an ocean. In your job, how often do you see corporate greed interfere with environmental sustainability and actions like deforestation and air pollution? Oh, so much. There's like all this good stuff coming out, like with Exxon and, planning for things like oh, we think we're going to have some climate action. Okay, we'll just make a ton of plastic, sell it to Africa, and which has no infrastructure to deal with it, and we'll make money that way. Like, recycling is not a thing, but we'll say that it is. Or there's just something that came out today that I haven't had time to read yet. I think it was about Chevron planning to just emit more and more and more, like under like a high emission scenario. Yeah, so like that's definitely a thing. Oil and gas companies are bad public information actors from what we have observed. There's a lot of misinformation. The one that on most because it's in the ocean field is the fact that recycling is essentially a lie. It has never worked. It will never work. Nobody knows how to do it so it works. But there was a big PR effort in the 80s and 90s to make it appear that it would work so people wouldn't stop buying plastic. So that's the example that's currently near and dear to my heart. But yeah, no, it's an issue. And a lot smarter people than me are trying to think about how to tackle it. I will say that one common thought is actually reviving the regulatory state in a functional way would be a major improvement on that. For example, like enforcing the existing laws and regulations around pollution, actually prosecuting white collar crime. Like these would be ways to deal with that. Really, really enforcing regulations that already exist, because so much of this is just written off by them as a cost of doing business. If you do like a horrible act in your corporation, you're fined like $32,000, like that, you just like write that off. That's nothing. But there's a lot of tightening up that could be done that I think could have a big effect. Would restricting fisheries that prey on predator species help balance trophic levels and food webs on a large scale? Would this change be a legitimate help with the restoration efforts for endangered fish species as a helping hand to lowering emissions? That's an interesting question. I think it's really specific. It's really ecosystem specific. So I'll give you like a couple of examples to maybe help illustrate it. So there are unusual circumstances where like taking out predators actually really makes a difference. And like the example I'm thinking of is there's some sea lions that just figured out that they could just sit on dams and eat entire runs of endangered salmon. So in this case, like sea lions are cute and fuzzy, but most salmon experts agree that these particular individual sea lions who do this are not helpful and need to be removed. And by removing these sea lions, which are predators, you can help restore the endangered salmon run. Now you might say the reason they're able to do this is because there's dams in the river that the salmons can't get by in the first place, which is legitimate and true. Other predator species, so there's just a lot of trophic levels in the ocean, and you probably already know this, but it's like the webs are complex and nonlinear in most places. So another example, I guess, would be tuna, which are obviously a top predator, but like I don't like restricting tuna fishing, you get more tuna and like less bycatch of other things, but I don't know that that would have any effect on their prey species, because their prey species are so small and abundant, like, you know, these little forage fish, that I don't know that that would be the thing. The thing about forage fish, and so then I guess sorry, you're benefiting from my like babbling and brainstorming with absolutely no feedback from any audience. Sorry. So, and then a third example, I guess, that might get more at what you're asking is the way to manage these small, what are called forage fish. So that's sardines, anchovies, menhaden, things like that. And these are really the small fish on the ecosystem. They are the base of the ecosystem. The health of the ecosystem depends on them, but it's to manage them directly and to do what's called ecosystem-based management. These fish are heavily and directly fished by people. And it's like predator fish are not really the issue. They are fished to provide both animal feed and fish feed. They're not actually as much eaten by people directly. So by making sure that we are not overfishing these forage fish, like that does have a really important and direct health effect on the ecosystem. I don't know what the equivalent is in the Gulf of Mexico, because I know the least about the Gulf of Mexico, which makes me sad, and I should come and learn more about it. But in the Atlantic, it's menhaden and herring, and in the Pacific, it's sardine and anchovy. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please type in another question. I agree with 100% clean future, but say if the US did make that goal, If other countries and territories did not go along with it, would it still make a big difference with climate change and everything? Yes. So yeah, this is a common argument that people make. And I mean, so there's sort of two responses. One, like, is we can only do what we can do. Like, this is not the ethical way to behave is not just like a spiral to the bottom, because then what do we win? We're all at the bottom. Like, it's like, what is the prize here with everyone tries to like emit the most and get the most, and then what do we get? So we can only in the US control what we are doing. Although I will say that the US actually truly is a leader on the international scale. And we've seen this with this sort of change of focuses that we've experienced. When the US was leading, other countries were taking action. Now the US is not leading, other countries are not taking action. Now, people always bring up China, but China is actually taking a lot of climate action. It's not perfect by any means, but they really are also doing things domestically to reduce their emissions because they can see, I mean, their water comes from Himalayan glaciers. Like, they know where their water comes from, like, and they know which direction this is going. They're controlled by a nuclear armed country, which is India, which does not like them very much. So I guess I would say that like the race to the bottom argument, or the like me first argument, or the like, unless if I see anyone else not doing exactly what I'm doing, I'm going to take my toys and go home argument is like not, I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just like responding to these like people who make this in like a rude and not helpful way. Like that's not the way we should go. That's not how we should be as an American people. And I do really believe that, because it was the case before. If America leads, the world is going to see that. And I think that a lot of other countries that are looking to us for leadership will respond. All right, that I believe is the end of questions that I can see.
Yeah, I think that's all that were typed in there. Oh, that was very good. Really good questions.
Yeah, those are super good questions. Does anyone else want to type a late breaking question?
So even though you couldn't see them, they were paying attention.
Oh, I know. I have to say, it's weird. It's weird. I'm sure all your speakers are experiencing this.
I know it is weird, but otherwise you might be looking at so many faces, it's overwhelming, or black boxes with names on them. So also can be when you're teaching in Zoom and you feel like you're talking to yourself sometimes. So
yeah,
we get used to it, but no, you had 50 active participants, so they were listening.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. Hill. Thank you, Jamie, for inviting me. And I hope to, at some point in the future, meet you in person.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I think this is really great, and great for students to know that there's opportunity to do such exciting and important things with their degree. You know, you get a lot of questions like, if I major in biology, what can I do? And you can do any of these really amazing things that make the world a better place. So thank you.
Oh, you absolutely can. And I guess I didn't actually talk about this, but just thinking about things in a scientific way and organizing your brain like that is incredibly valuable. So it's that, because people, when I worked in Congress, would try to lie with data all the time, like the most ridiculous lies. But like, because most of the staff didn't have that training, they couldn't see them as well. So you would learn really valuable skills by majoring in biology, just like about data and about clear and logical writing. That would my other tip is like the other most important skill is writing, right? Is excellence in writing. So
yes.
But yeah, you will you could do lots of things. So I majored in biology. It was great. I had fun. I don't remember anything about the Krebs cycle. Nothing.
Yeah. But like you said, it's the skills you learned in learning biology that serve you well now. So hopefully they all heard that and will take that to heart as they go through their curriculum.
I hope so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. It was really nice to meet you. I'm going to follow you on Twitter now so I can know all the cool things that Dr. Hill knows.
Excellent. And any students with further questions should certainly feel free to drop me an email or a Twitter DM.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.